You came to Canada and joined LeStudio. How did that happen?
Well, I was working with Gentle Giant. I'd left AdVision, which was basically because they were okay for me to do, if I could bring projects into the studio, then they didn't mind me working, doing the occasional going out and doing live things, which I did with Gentle Giant. I recorded them live. But when they wanted to record somewhere else and they wanted me to do it, then the studio said, well, you have to leave. You can't work for the competition, as it were. So they said, but if you leave, we'll do an arrangement. If you bring work here, then we'll pay you, the work that you bring here. So it worked out, and so I was freelancing. So I started freelancing, I think, when I was 21, which was a bit scary because you'd get a few calls to work at the same time. I had Mick Taylor from the Stones was doing his first solo album. I started working on that, and then I needed to go to America to do something that had been planned with. Actually, I was coming to LeStudio to do some recording with Gentle Giant, or with the guys from Gentle Giant, not the band itself. And immediately I got back to England. I was no longer, I was sort of persona non grata because I hadn't been available for Mick Taylor. So yeah. You suddenly find that you're getting all the work coming at the same time, and then you'll have months where there isn't anything, so it's pretty scary. So consequently, I did 2 independent projects where I came to LeStudio, and the owner of the studio, Andre Perry, asked me to join the studio. He said, would you be interested in coming to, and it hadn't occurred to me to move to Canada, but the offer sort of remained open for a long time, and I set up a friend of mine with the job initially, and then that fell through. He decided he didn't want to move to Canada. But so about a year after I'd been first offered it, I decided that I would do it because being independent was chaotic and scary. So I just decided to move and thought I would be home every couple of months because we tended to work non-stop, 12, 14 hours a day for 7 days a week. That's the way you worked in studios at that time. The studios, big projects may be locked out, 24-hour days. So, well, they'd pay for a 12-hour day, but you'd have the studio locked out, so all the equipment was left set up, and nobody else could record in the room. So you tended to do projects that would start and just go every day, 12 hours a day until they finished. So usually you'd have a few weeks off at the end of that. So I expected to be home, every couple of months. I'd be home for a month or something. And I didn't go home for a year and a half because I was having so much fun. It's a great place to live. I still live here, up in the Laurentians. It's a beautiful place to live.
So you still live in Montreal?
No, it's not Montreal. It's north of Montreal, about an hour, Morin Heights.
Oh, okay.
So I still live here. The Morin Heights studio, LeStudio was because it no longer exists. It was in the Laurentians, about an hour north of Montreal.
Oh, okay.
And it was a residential place, which was not very common at that time. And the value in it was that, and the very reason that we, with Ray and Derek Shulman from Gentle Giant, that I came to the studio was that they were managing and producing a band from Pennsylvania. And you would spend more money in a hotel and transportation and food doing a project with 6 or 7 people involved, and in this case it would have been maybe more than that, 7 or 8 people involved, if you go to New York or Los Angeles, you've got hotels, you've got to cater to everybody. There's a lot involved before you even pay for the studio time. So the value of a residential studio, if you had good enough technology, was that you could have, really nice accommodations, and everything was right in house, so there was no distractions. And that was the value of Morin Heights. It was very technically very well put together studio in a beautiful environment overlooking the lake with great accommodation, and so it attracted people from all around the world. And whilst I was there, I went through a period of being one of the most successful studios in the world.
So one of the next bands I see you worked with is a Windsor band called Tease on One Night Stands and Body Shots. Any memories of working with those guys?
Yes, well, it was, if I remember rightly, Miles Goodwin was producing them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I did that. We did a certain amount of it, I think, at Miles's house with a mobile truck. I would imagine, I can't remember it in detail, I imagine we probably recorded the drums at the studio and then perhaps went to Miles's place. And then it's actually, that's kind of I remember the guys, I remember the band, and I remember recording it in a mobile truck. So I'm just sort of thinking, I think I was still probably on staff at the studio at that time. So I guess it was probably because we only had one studio and it was busy, and the studio didn't mind me going off and doing that because we were going to mix it. We tracked it at Morin Heights and we went back and we mixed it there. So I think we did anyway. Anyway, that's probably why, because I distinctly remember staying with Miles and having the truck parked in his driveway. So yeah, that's an oddball one actually, one I'd forgotten about. But and I, Miles was Montreal based, so he was producing them. And it was, I think, on Aquarius, probably,
Mm-hmm.
Donald K. Donald's label, which was April Wine's label. And April Wine was a sort of, for a while, was a staple of the studio at Morin Heights. They did 3, I think, albums there, if not more. In fact, actually 4 albums, because I think Nick Lagona did the first 2 and I did the next 2.
How many records with Nick did you end up doing over the years?
Well, Nick was the engineer at Morin Heights first, when there was just basically, it was a 2-room operation, so they needed 2 people to keep it busy, but both rooms weren't working all the time. So we would be flipping backwards and forwards and doing different projects. And because you worked literally 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and often usually at that time, an album would be at least 6 weeks, if not 2 months. And that was kind of moving fairly quickly. Later on, we got into the albums that took 6 months, 5 months, 6 months. So when you do that, like one person is not doing much for a long period of time. So we didn't used to work side by side on records so much. We did a couple of them we would have done, but him mixing or me recording or vice versa, those kinds of things. But usually one of us did one project and somebody needed a break, and there was another project coming in, and I would do the other one or something. So it was kind of like, that's the way it worked. There was, for about 3 or 4 years, both myself and Nick were, actually it may have been a bit more than that, but maybe it's 5 years that we worked together at Morin Heights.
In 1980, you joined Rush to engineer Permanent Waves. Were you aware of them at that time? Because they were still a fairly niche band.
Yes, well, yeah, because I'd seen them when I was in England. I'd seen them, I think, on the Old Grey Whistle Test probably doing their Farewell to Kings tour. So Old Grey Whistle Test was a British TV show on the BBC. And I remember seeing, Rush with the long sleeves and, Geddy playing Minnie Moog and all the sort of drama of that sort of at the end of the progressive rock era, I guess, at a time when it wasn't particularly cool. I also remember the Notorious Sounds interview that they did, where I remember reading it, where they were very much into Ayn Rand philosophy at the time, or either Neil was or the band was, and some of the lyrics were about that kind of independent thinking and stuff. And the very sort of leftist interviewer for Sounds, I remember writing that he thought that they were the nicest bunch of Nazis that he'd ever met. And I mean, they came in for some really absurd, which is ironic because, with Geddy being Jewish. So, but the British music press are a law unto themselves. They like to they I think they're more enamored with their own writing than they are with the artists and the music that they cover. It's very much that way. So they always want to discover people and build them up, and then once they're successful, they like to drag them down. So the British music press is kind of hilarious in some respects. And the Sounds I think it was Sounds, not Melody Maker. I think it was the Sounds interview. I remember reading that, and they sounded like a really nice bunch of guys, but they had these very more right-wing or independent thinking kind of philosophy, which didn't really sit well with the lefty British music press.
Yeah. From what I understand in the studio, Rush wanted to not only experiment with their music, but also with constantly changing gear and mics and preamps and everything. What sort of gear and stuff did you use on those records, and any kind of memories of working on things like that with Rush?
Yeah, well, I can pretty much remember everything that we did because that's what I do. So,
Yeah.
I mean that their experimentalism. I mean, I think from a musical point of view, that's the primary reason, and there's being experimental is a sort of very creative and positive thing to do, where you just keep pushing yourself, trying things in unusual ways, using different things. But sometimes experimenting for its own sake is not always productive, because in the case of Rush, I think their musical experimentation was very productive, and sonically we sometimes were experimenting with, like changing mics for the sake of changing mics, because we'd used them on the last song and they sounded really good. So now let's try a whole bunch of different ones to get something different, which in theory is an interesting way to keep challenging yourself. But there are so many other things that come into play, and generally speaking, these days people don't do that, except for there's times when using really radical and weird, unusual recording techniques is really, really creative, and I agree with that, and I do it myself. But on another level, where if you decide to just change things because you used it last time, it's not always such a productive way to do things. So invariably, I think on both Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures, I don't think there were any two songs that we had the same miking on for the consecutive songs. As soon as we'd finished a song, we'd change a lot of the mics, for no reason other than the fact that, well, we just used the other ones and let's change the new ones. And so and when you listen to the record, you wouldn't necessarily know, because invariably if you choose a mic that's brighter on some instrument, then you're going to equalize it to change it back. So
yeah.
But at the same time, the experimentalism was creative in another way. Like the long form songs that they do just lend themselves to that, and hunting for unusual sounds. Now we have so much gear that makes weird sounds, you actually probably need to limit yourself more than you do. It's more like we're in an era of like multicolored photography now, where sometimes people hanker for black and white. And in recording, we've got so much technology that people hanker for simple old school recording with gear that forces you to do things in a certain way, so I mean, there was definitely a lot of experimenting going on. I'd say that. We did things like record guitar solos with speakers piped out over the lake, and recording the reverb off of the lake from the guitar.
Oh wow!
And we recorded an acoustic guitar. I remember on Natural Science, we recorded acoustic guitar sitting down by the water with somebody. I think it was either the natural sound of the waves lapping on the side of the water, or somebody was sitting there with a paddle or something like that, making it sound, giving it more interesting context and stuff like that. And on Witch Hunt, I remember us all going out in the parking lot and pretending to be a mob of angry mob mentality, screaming and shouting in the middle of the night, with using the sound effects, for the background on Witch Hunt. Mm-hmm. So we did lots of fun stuff, actually, aside from like some really intense recording and editing and things like that. So when I recorded all of, up until I was involved, Terry had always done the recording, because he was an engineer as well. That was his engineer producer. And I think because I had so much experience at that time in England and doing bands that the guys were interested in, from Emerson, from Yes in particular probably, and not necessarily Gentle Giant per se, but the English music scene. I think the fact that I'd been recording English progressive rock for long time, and was obviously very experienced and competent, they decided that it was really interesting to have me do the engineering and Terry sit in the producer seat. So obviously because he comes from an engineering background, he would have a significant input in, okay, we're going to do this, let's try that. But I basically was doing the engineering, and he was producing on those records. On Permanent Waves, Rush came in for, I believe it was 6 or 8 weeks. I think it was 6 weeks we did the recording every day, 7 days a week, in the fall, and then they went to England to mix it. At that time, we were recording with a Trident console, which is what the studio had, and we had a small Neve console as well, which we used, I think, for kick and snare and probably the occasional bit of guitar recording. But the majority of the record was recorded through a Trident A series console, and it was recorded. I think we were actually. I don't think it wasn't 48 track. It was recorded 24 track, because I don't think we had an interlock system then, so we wouldn't have had 48 tracks. It might have been, but I think it was 24 track, with a Studer A80 tape machine, and the mics would have been mostly. I mean, I don't know to what degree you're interested in this, because this is very technical.
I've done some recording. I have a little bit of a knowledge, but obviously nothing like to the extent that you do.
At that time we were recording, we used a lot of condenser mics on drums, more than I would use now.
Nowadays you basically don't really use them.
No,
at least not for close miking.
Right, for close miking, most of the time you're using dynamics. Most people choose condenser mics for overheads and stuff like that, and cymbals, but not for apart from the odd sort of 47, maybe on a kick drum or something. But at that time we were using 87s and 67s on toms.
Really?
Yeah, oh yeah, and they got.
Oh my god.
Too. the number of really what would be now be regarded as priceless mics that had drumstick. You're always pressing out the windscreens on them to fix all the drumstick hits. So it would have been 87s and 67s on toms a lot of the time. Maybe a D20 on the kick, or a D12, which was like the precursor to the D12, and which is now considered an old mic. The D112 is the kind of current version of that, which is an AKG mic. AKG 414s, some Bayers and things like that, and Neumann, KM84s on cymbals on ride and hi-hat.
Wow, that had to be the most expensive drum set miking on the planet, probably.
I think maybe not so much in North America, but in England, that's most of the time. My experience was that everybody was using a lot of condenser mics on drum kits and stuff. It was only in the States that I started to use like a 57 and in North America, I started to use a 57 on the snare. I don't think I'd ever used one on a snare before I came to North America. Almost nobody did in England. A lot of people would use like a KM84 or something like that as a snare mic. Anyway, so that record was done in the fall, and then they went to Trident in England to mix it, which Terry did. Then after that, we got a brand new console in at Morin Heights, the SSL, the first one. Pretty much, it was actually the first one in North America, I think. It was the one that was shown at the AES when they first showed the E-Series SSL, and which for about 4 years nobody knew what it was, and they were very suspicious of it, and then it became the most successful recording console ever, probably.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the beginning of a certain kind of standardization of the recording business. Most major studios having an SSL, and most major studios having a pair of Yamaha NS10s sitting on top of the console. That was the kind of the standardization that started to happen in recording, and which meant that it was much easier for people to move around, because you always knew when you walked into a room, 8 out of 10 rooms would have that.
Yeah.
Of the better rooms anyway. So everybody, it was much easier to move around and be comfortably moved from one studio to another. I mean, that wouldn't be the reason that people would become independent, but it certainly facilitated being able to move around comfortably.
Mm-hmm. Now, were those early albums that you did, were they all 2-inch tape, or did you start using a digital storage medium?
No, 2-inch tape all the multi-tracking is 2-inch. Moving Pictures was 2-inch 48 tracks, so that means you're locking two 2-inch machines together electronically, which steals the track from each machine to synchronize them. So you end up 46 usable tracks. But because it's and the interlocks were at that time were pretty slow. Well, essentially they still are because they're not. But at that time they were very early, and sometimes it would take 10 seconds or even more sometimes for the machines to lock into sync. So you had to pre-roll long enough before the start of the song so that to allow the machines to lock in time. I mean, technically they were supposed to be able to lock in about 2 seconds, but invariably that wasn't the case. And so sometimes you'd have to, have this sort of significant pre-roll to make sure that everything was locked together by the time you started either mixing or recording. So most of the time you'd record all the basic tracks, the sort of drums, bass, and basic track guitars on one machine. Then you'd make a rough mix of that, or a reduced mix of that, onto your second machine. And that would give you'd maybe have 6 tracks with the drums and the bass and the guitars. And then you'd have another 16 or 17 tracks to play with on the second machine, where you could layer up vocals and do all the more incidental overdubs and solos and things like that. So then you would, when you mixed it, you'd lock the 2 machines together and use the first generation copy of drums and guitars and bass from the original machine, and then all the additional overdubs would be played back from the second machine.
So even in those days, it was still fairly common to bounce tracks down to get more tracks, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
When I was doing, actually, that was an interesting thing that when they came to the studio to do Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures, well, for Permanent Waves initially, I think they liked the studio's it was an impressive place, sort of visually, and from a point of view, the equipment was really good. The kind of projects that had been coming through were really good, and we got a few techniques that had, that were not necessarily common, that I think Nick had essentially picked up from Roy Thomas Baker, because Nick Lagona had worked quite a bit with Roy Thomas Baker at Morin Heights, and he'd done stuff with Nazareth, and mainly from Roy, the idea of multi-tracking things to a high degree was very common, particularly obviously in the case of Queen. Queen didn't work in the studio, but that kind of approach of doing, I mean, in the case of Queen, I think every single vocal track was tracked 7 times, I think. So it was 7 tracks of lead vocals, 7 tracks of harmony, 7 tracks of every single part.
Oh my God! And in the early '70s, that was just insane.
So that was something that Roy Baker, in his sort of typically over the top kind of approach to recording, had just sort of settled on. And then Nick worked with him, and then they'd sort of discovered that recording kind of guitars, triple tracking guitars, was a really good effect, in the sense of it gave you a powerful sound, and it was more smooth and with less kind of tuning issues than if you double tracked it. And so we used that technique because the guys in Rush hadn't come across that, and they were interested in it. So we used that technique on Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures, where every main guitar part was tracked 3 times. But in the case of Alex, it meant 6, because we have a stereo spread of guitars on the left and guitars on the right to give you a big wide, big fat sound. And in order to not have and you put them extreme left and right, so it leaves a hole in the middle for the vocals and the drums to come through. So obviously, when you put things extreme left and right, there's still a certain amount of spillover just in the room you're listening in. But basically, there would be 3 guitars on the left, 3 guitars on the right playing the identical thing, which gave the guitar sound a pretty big and fat sound, which I think actually was very beneficial at that time. But after Moving Pictures, I think probably because Alex was bored with it at that point, because there's a certain part of doing that is actually a little bit boring. You record a great guitar track, and then you double it, and then you double and do another track, and then you go on the other side of the stereo and you do the same thing again. So there's a lot of repetitive stuff. So it gives you a good sound, but it maybe takes away from the expression in the playing. We didn't do that with guitar solos. That wouldn't have. I mean, not that you couldn't do that, but guitar solos, by their very spontaneity, aren't the kind of things that lend themselves to that. But sort of basic power guitar stuff, it works very well. But the downside of it is you get maybe a bit less expression in the performance, because it becomes kind of a little bit sterilized by the layering of it. But you gain something in sonically, big, fat, smooth, powerful sound. And I think it stands up today. The guitar sounds on moving pictures, particularly, and on permanent waves, really do stand up and they're not as heavily overdriven as often people use now. But yet they still sound big. So it worked really well. I mean, moving pictures is to this day one of the records that I feel most proud of. It's just one of those things. It happens at various times. If you basically do this long enough, periodically you'll come across projects that it just magically all comes together, and it's extraordinary. And that, despite the fact that doing moving pictures, we had extraordinary technical difficulties because everything was new. There was a new console that had problems with its automation. We had an interlock system that was less than ideal because they were still in the early days the interlocking was sometimes not very efficient, and you'd have to wait 20 seconds from just playing before it's all locked together, which really slows the session down. And also we had a terrible batch of Ampex tape, which we were using a formula of tape called Ampex 456 at that time. And there was one batch that went out across the whole of North America that after you'd been using it for about a month, or maybe even less, started to deteriorate. So by the time we were mixing during moving pictures, the oxide was falling off the tape, and it kind of gums up the heads on the tape machine. So after 2 passes, you'd have to clean the heads again, and they'd be black with oxide, and the high end would go off the tape. So we were constantly battling. There was 1 or 2 reels of it. It wasn't true of every reel, but I think on Vital Signs was one where we keep going, what happened? The tambourine's gone. Where's the tambourine? Top end's gone off the tambourine. So turn around and there's all black oxide on the tape, on the heads of the machine. And so we started to be worried that we weren't going to get the mix finished before the tape started to disintegrate. That subsequently became notorious. There was quite a few records that went through that at that time.
So are those tapes now essentially gone and fully deteriorated, or do they
no,
still exist?
They would have been transferred into digital format at this point. These days, in order to do that, when you have tapes that are that old, I think any tape that's over about 10 or 15 years old, and these ones would have probably been 20 years old at the time, they usually bake them. They put just a sort of like, I'm not sure what kind of temperature they do it at, maybe a couple of 200 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. I'm not sure what the baking temperature is that they use. Or it might not be as much as that, because I know some people do it by just sticking it on top of a radiator. But anyway, you need to heat the tape up so that then you get 1 or 2 chances to pass it over a tape machine without doing significant damage. But then from the moment you've ever baked a tape, I think you pretty much always have to bake it before you play it. So you basically get 1 or 2 chances. You bake the tape, it dries it out, makes the kind of glue that holds the oxide on sort of a little bit more tight, and then you can copy it into digital format, and then essentially from that moment onwards you pretty much kiss goodbye to the tape. I'm sure that the 2-inch tapes of moving pictures and permanent waves probably still exist, but it's quite possible that if you tried to unravel them, that they might just be stuck like a reel of Scotch tape. Oxide will just pull off it as you open it, so that's where things stand with that. So those tapes would have been transferred, though. They were transferred to digital format.
Now in 2002, you returned to work on Vapor Trails with Rush. What was it like working with the band again after nearly 20 years, especially in their current situation at that time?
Well, I did a couple of projects between, because after live albums, after Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures, and Signals, and Exit Stage Left, which I did whilst I was at Morin Heights.
Did you do? Was it Grace Under Pressure?
No, that one was done. That was done at Morin Heights, but it was done by Peter Henderson, who used to work with Supertramp.
Okay.
I was around at the time. I did some programming, I think, for Geddy on the Oberheim or on a PPG, I think, on that record, because I was interested in synth programming at the time. But I was around and about at the studio, but Peter Henderson was producing it and with them, and he was an engineer himself, and he just did it. So subsequent to that, I did different stages, which was a massive kind of recording project that was recorded on ADAT machines, actually live off the console, but they'd recorded so many shows that there was a massive amount of recording to sift through, and we did that. I mixed that for them, which also included remixing an old Hammersmith Odeon concert from 1978, which was amazing. So we had the kind of modern recording all done digitally, and then one 2-inch tape with from 20 years previous, which was actually fun to work on. And then that kept me, aside from being friends with them and friends with Neil, that kept me kind of in the loop with Rush for a number of years in between. Mm-hmm. And so when after Neil's tragedy with his family, loss of his family, he didn't actually pick up a set of drumsticks, I think, for 18 months. And at the time, probably didn't necessarily think he was going to play drums again. I thought he might actually just write or something like that. He was very much riding his motorcycle across North America and trying to just keep his life together, really. And there was a doubt that, Rush would ever do anything again. But then spontaneously, Neil just decided he got a hankering to play some drums. And my wife was managing Morin LeStudio at the time, and Neil called up and said, "Can we arrange for him to do drums, to set up his drum kit in the video shooting stage, which is a great place to set a drum kit up." And we had a pseudonym, so nobody knew who it was, and I think even the office weren't informed, because he didn't want people to think that he was going to be playing again, so everybody's hopes would get up, and he wanted to see what it felt like. So he basically booked in about a week at Morin LeStudio just to play drums, just to be in a big room with a big drum kit and make a lot of noise and see what it felt like, whether and he enjoyed himself, just getting back into the physicality of playing, and so then slowly and surely they started to sort of talk about the possibility of doing a bit of recording. And it went so, but by the time they got back into the studio, I think it had been about 5 years since the previous recording sessions. In the meantime, Geddy and Alex had done solo albums, and Neil had done, which I did with him actually, the Buddy Rich tribute record, which was very much a side project, didn't have any relation to the kind of music that he makes, in the rock world. But in Geddy and Alex's case, they did their own solo projects, which were essentially sort of their own individualist versions of the kinds of things that they do when they're working with Rush. So what that meant is when they came back together, aside from the fact they are really great friends, and there was a lot of deference to each other, there was a certain, it was an unusual situation to walk into to record them. I think they asked me to do it mainly partly because of my experience and what I was doing. I'd been working on some substantial stuff, rock stuff in the US with Marilyn Manson, and I think at that time I'd done the whole record with Courtney Love. I'd done Manson record, or at least done the drum tracking on that, and Suicidal Tendencies and Alice Cooper. I'd done quite a lot of work. And was keeping very current. And I think the combination of those things, the fact that I was part of the family, meant that they felt comfortable about getting back in the studio and me being behind the console. At the same time, it was emotionally kind of not difficult, but there were difficult might be a word to use. Neil hadn't played for so long. And it takes a lot when you play at the level that he does. He has to, as he said, I have to build up the calluses on my hand. But I think but also, he'd not long previously gone through an experimental point where he changed from playing from match grip to traditional grip in his drum style, which is very, very different and quite as intensely powerful. It's got a nice fluidity to it to use traditional grip. But he was renowned for his power, which is very much, to a large extent, really does come from match grip playing, where you hold both sticks the same way in a sort of fist grip. the power comes from your shoulders and your biceps perhaps more than. And obviously, there's a lot of technique, whichever way you play drums. But the traditional grip is the sideways holding of the left hand, and it's a very different approach to the way you play. So combination of those things, and that he hadn't played for very long, meant that he wasn't in the same kind of space as a drummer when I walked in on the session. And they'd been recording demos for about 5 months prior to me getting there. So we opted to carry on recording in the same manner because everybody was comfortable. They liked the studio. I liked the studio too. It was a very nice, comfortable place to record. It was convenient for them, and it was intimate. There was no other projects going on at the studio, so it was just them.
So did you record that in Toronto then?
Yes, it was a Reaction, I think, was the name of the studio, if I remember. But the studio itself wasn't really a great drum room. So the decision was, well, what can we do? But we wanted to keep the kind of family atmosphere going and not suddenly up. It was an option to pick up and move. But so what I decided to do is we just tore out the almost all of the dampening in the studio and drywalled the whole room essentially to make it into one big drum booth, which worked quite well. It changed it from being a very dead recording space to quite live. So essentially, and it also meant that we could just maintain our family atmosphere all in the same place without any other strangers around. And so the dynamics between the guys were comfortable and everything. But the other thing that was different about that record is that I worked with all of them individually, which was... it was the first record they did where it was entirely done on computer. The value of that being that all the demos that they'd experimented with kind of random ideas that sometimes had inspiration in them that was very creative, were already there. And because it's done on computer, usually they'd have played to a click track or something. So all these guide tracks, multi-tracked guide tracks, would be down. So the song structure was in really good shape. And the tempos are all set. It was very easy to play over it, which was a technique they'd been using for some time, but not necessarily on a computer. But they'd often done where they'd done pre-demoed their songs with click tracks, and then Neil would be able to go and play a take beginning to end, and then spin back and do another take, and then edit between takes. That was the approach we were using, so we maintained working on computer. What it also meant was that, because I got guide vocals, guide guitars, or some good guitars, and guide bass, and everything on a very locked bed track, Neil and I could just work by ourselves, and he could just work on ideas and get up to speed and really get the intensity in his playing that he needed to get to because of who he is and what he's known for and what he was trying to achieve. And so between him and I, we'd work together for a few hours during the day. And then at the end of the evening, or about sort of 7 or 8 o'clock at night, Geddy and Alex would be invited to come, and they could critique and choose if we thought we had a drum track, we'd usually have like 3 or 4 takes that we considered to be viable drum tracks, and then they could come and have some input and decide whether they thought they were good or we needed to do something else. So that meant that I worked with Neil by himself, and the deal was they had to bring something from their extensive wine cellars, so whilst they came and listened and critiqued what we'd been doing during the day. So it worked like that, and I worked with each person separately, which was, I think, partly out of deference to everybody as individuals. Geddy and Alex wanted to give Neil some space, and just to be able to let him find his own kind of, comfort with where it needed to be. And both Geddy and Alex had done solo albums, so were used to sort of just basically being able to do anything they felt like doing on their own project. And I think to some degree wanted to still have a bit of that quality in the way they worked. At the same time, they knew that at a certain point they all had to agree on where they were going, what they were doing. And so that's where, even though there was never any real difficulty in the sense of people arguing, it was more of a difficulty in the sense that everybody wanted everybody else to be happy. So it was a little, the difference in vision of what was the dominant force of the record sometimes was, because I know Alex was really very interested in very aggressive guitar sounds at the time and stuff like that. His favorite stuff, I think, was very much Nine Inch Nails sort of direction, which has an intensity and a power that can be very good, but at the same time, how that blends in with what Rush is all about. Whereas Geddy was, I think, more interested in the melodies and what he was doing vocally. So right there, you have a natural battle. It's not a battle about who's right or wrong. It's a battle about, okay, well, how do we make these things work together? This kind of slightly different visions of what. And I think because we got into a very difficult time mixing that record, and I think that ultimately that's where that came from. Initially, when we were mixing, it was going great, and I think I started mixing the record in sort of early December, and after a couple of weeks, we mixed about 5 or 6 songs, and everybody was going home for Christmas going, wow, it's going great, sounds great. And then when I got back home, we took a break. I didn't listen to anything away for Christmas. We'd been working for 6 months on the record, and then after Christmas, it was like, no, it doesn't. It's not right. It sounds it sounds all too compressed. It doesn't sound right. So suddenly it was like, oh, okay. So we went through. I spent another 2 or 3 weeks mixing with them, still with not real. It was a struggle, and so then it was decided that we'd get somebody else to mix it. So I stepped out of the process, and Dave Leonard came in and mixed with them, and so at the end of the day, I think by the time the record was finished, I think it was very kind of torturous, and I think that everybody just wanted to get it over with. Mm-hmm. And so it was, when it finally came out, it was a very powerful record with a lot of emotion, and I think some great writing on it, and great sort of song structures and interesting and creative stuff. But it suffered. The mixing and mastering was a problem, and I think it was a thorn in the band's side for a long time, and they knew that they needed to revisit it, or was intended to, but I think it's taken as long as it has for them to finally, it has been remixed, the entire thing, which is wonderful. And Dave Bottrell was mixing it in Toronto, and I haven't heard it, but I've spent some time talking with him, and sounds like he's done a fantastic job. And I think everybody's going to have a lot of fun listening to some, the remix version of that album, because it's an important record from a point of view of where Rush, it was that bridge from early Rush to almost the breakup of the band. And then, well, at the time when they made the record, they didn't think that they would actually tour. Alex and Geddy didn't think that Neil would want to tour. And I sort of begged to differ, because I thought that, particularly Neil had remarried, and I knew that, I thought, you can't be who you are and not want the most important person in your life at the time to not know who you are and see, what you do. And aside from the fact that I'm part of him, obviously, just as much as he sometimes says he hates touring, I think he likes it up until the first few shows, and once the first few really great shows have gone down, then it becomes a job. But he's very motivated, I think, to do a really great show at the beginning. I think Neil's very much a driven person that likes to. He's a perfectionist, but once he's achieved that, then he doesn't really want to do it every night again and again and again. So he has a love-hate relationship with touring. So anyway, so I helped him get through making Vapor Trails, and I've thought about that record a lot, all the things I could have done different, and why was it difficult, and why, where it got to where it's at. But at the end of the day, they ended up with a record. They went out and toured, and then rebuilt their sort of band spirit, and have gone on to do some great stuff. So all things said and done, I'm still glad to have been asked to be involved in that, and it was a very dramatic time, So.
Okay, so now I'd like to just go back, and we'll just start looking at some of the other bands and projects you've done over the years. God, that was like an hour's worth of Rush. And the funny thing, we're only maybe a quarter through the questions I had planned.
You're going to have to do some serious editing, so But at least this will be on record. I'm recording it as well, so if ever I want to write a book, I can just write all this down.
That'd be fantastic. You should.
Well, sometimes I think about it because of just having lived through, just the privilege of having been in the recording business for 40 years, from the early 70s to current day, which is a massively different recording environment with different techniques, different technology, and a different whole kind of cultural environment the recording process is. So it is. I think it's interesting. At the very least, I think it might be interesting for my daughter, so she has a record of what crazy stuff her father went through, and in the process, it might be interesting for other people. I don't know. I don't have any pretensions about writing particularly, except that it's just an interesting journey, and some people love this stuff. They want to know everything about how records are made, and it affects the way they do things now. And so people need to write these things down, and I guess I'm one of those people, so I probably should.
Well, here's your impetus to get started, I say.